Ben,
In progress.
here we go. I welcome you back to the Seleukid lecture series. I'm Altai Joshkun from the University of Waterloo, and together with Rabbi Ben Scolnic, I'm hosting this series for a couple of years now. We had a little break to give some room for Seleukid Study Day 8 at Utrecht on reception of the Seleukids, and today's paper will actually reconnect with the larger reception theme. So it is my real distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Kai Brodersen amongst us. He is a most distinguished colleague. No doubt about that. There is a little bit of doubt how much pleasure I have in introducing him, because when I interact with him, he is so humble, so kind, and then I sometimes forget what a tycoon he actually is. Going through his CV just to find the pinnacles for his introduction has actually been a big amount of work, and I am scared to do the right thing today. Just imagine he started his academic career when he was still going to school. At the age of 16, he became an auditor at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, and that is basically how his career then continued, with his main degrees from the Ludwig Maximilians University in München and St. John's College in Oxford. His first connection with the Seleukids was very early in his career, because his PhD was an important commentary on a major part of Appian Syriacae, defended in 1986 and then published in 1989. As this was only one major part, namely the sketch of the Seleukid dynasty in the later chapters, he completed his work 2 years later and then published the Antiochicae, as he entitled the first part. So he laid ground to a very important study, the study of Appian, so important for Seleukid studies. And there is a connection which may explain his interest in the Seleukids, because his doctor father was Hatto Schmidt, the author of, as far as I know, the first monograph on Antiochus III in German. So he was well positioned to take a major stand in the field of Seleukid studies in Germany, and he followed up by his edited volume in 1999, Zwischen Ost und West, a quite interesting title, which from an Anglophone perspective may be seen as a forerunner of the development that now in the Anglophone world pays a lot more attention to the Eastern connections and the intermediate position of the Seleukids between the Greek world in the West, or in the Mediterranean, and other Oriental societies. But to be honest, from a German perspective, the tradition in which Kai stands through his Dr. Vater Hatto Schmidt and his Dr. Opa Hermann Bengtson, and then Walter Otto and Eduard Meyer, actually always made this connection very clear, and always emphasized the Near Eastern traditions and connections in Greek and Greco-Roman history. It would have been easy if Kai had just stuck to the Seleukids in his career, but he did so much more. It is nearly impossible for me to summarize all his fields of research, but he has multiple lives. He's not only a researcher, but also someone for whom service is actually very important. His first professorship at Mannheim, which he took, I think, in 1995 or 6, already marked this pathway out. He soon became dean and then vice president. And when he was appointed at Erfurt University in the early 2000s, he was, in I think 2008, he was appointed as president of the university, and he served 2 periods until 2014, when he became a regular professor. But was he only a regular professor? No, he had so much extra time and energy. He is also, as to my knowledge, the most prolific publisher, author in our fields. Most importantly, as the editor of Historia for 21 years, and it's so nice to see Christelle Fischer-Beauvais with us, who succeeded Kai in this role, especially for the Hellenistic period. But that's not yet enough to fill Kai's days and nights. So I think it was in 2005 that he founded the publishing house with the beautiful name Kartoffeldruck, where he had the idea that there are so many interesting ancient and Renaissance authors and fields that regular publishing houses do not easily take up into their program. And he just started publishing as on his own in this house, and it's developed into a very big enterprise. And believe it or not, I couldn't believe it myself. Only in the last year he published 23 volumes as editors himself in this series. So that even tops by far the amount of articles that I have published in my best years. So it is quite astounding. And beyond that, I would say the younger generation knows Kai's name, I think, best for the service he does to the community at large, through the mailing lists he runs, so Antiqua list, job postings internationally, and also his book list, and so many other things that I might point out. So I have developed the theory that there is not just one Kai, but in his basement there must be a legion of clones that are reading and writing day in, day out, and we are here only gifted one of these many Kais who spend some time with us. So I can bring the things together, his interest in the Seleucids and all literature in the field, including the Maccabean and biblical literature, but also very remote authors that he has dedicated himself to, which yielded or are about to yield two of his latest book publications on the fourth book of Maccabees and a Latin variation by a certain Quinquinius, forthcoming, I think, this year, unless they have just been released from the press. And we will be gifted with one digression to this field, a beautiful addition to the many reception topics that we learned about at Utrecht 2 months ago. So I would say we are now really excited to hear what you have to tell us, Kai, but to extend the tension a little bit further, there will be a second introduction by Ben, to whom I pass the mic.
Okay, thank you. So I just have a few, don't get excited, this is just a few slides, but I'm doing it this way because I have to limit myself because I'm so excited about this paper. I'm afraid of taking too long. So I'm just calling, I want to talk a little bit before and a little bit after Kai, just to frame it for our field. Kai's going to give us an account about a chapter in the transmission of 4 Maccabees. And how does this fit in our studies of the Seleukid world? As Altai just said, one of our emphases is reception. In fact, we recently held this major international conference in Utrecht that Altai mentioned on the reception of the Seleucids in history and culture from ancient texts down to video games. There was a lot about video games. Second Maccabees, a work of the Seleukid era, has an interesting history of composition and an interesting history of reception. There were at least 3 and perhaps 4 editions of Second Maccabees, probably all from the 2nd century BC, that is, in the Seleukid era. 4 Maccabees, which is what Kai's going to be talking about, develops Second Maccabees, again, a Seleukid work, at great length, but with its own emphases based on Platonic and Stoic thought, such as the sovereignty of reason. It was probably written a few centuries later, and some scholars think it was written in the 1st century CE in Syrian Antioch. So it's very important to understand that Second Maccabees 7, which is the story of the mother and her sons, which we'll be talking about, equals, and just look at this, 4 Maccabees 8 through 17. So one chapter is taken and developed. So if each of the 7 sons is martyred, each one gets his own chapter in 4 Maccabees, whereas in 2nd Maccabees 7, it was all in one chapter. So you can see the expansion of the story. Kai will tell us a very precious story, and I really mean this. It's a very precious story about the tenuousness of transmission. In this case, we're going to see the role of Christian scholars and nuns in the transmission of 4 Maccabees. But I have to say, from my own perspective, that 4 Maccabees is a very Jewish text, adding Jewishness to the original Jewish text of 2nd Maccabees 6 through 7. In it, Judaism is called the true philosophy. The martyrs, the sons, are called the true children of Abraham, with a number of references, who take their place as examples to be emulated like other biblical greats like Joseph. The scribe Eliezer of 2nd Maccabees 6 now becomes a priest and a distinguished philosopher who debates with Antiochus, and Antiochus did not appear in 2nd Maccabees 6. So just to say it again, the story in 2nd Maccabees 6 is about Eliezer, a scribe in Jerusalem. The story in 2nd Maccabees 7, and both of these stories become the basis for 4 Maccabees. 2nd Maccabees 7, the story of the mother and her sons, does not seem to happen in Jerusalem. So 4 Maccabees presents a subtle solution to a problem in reading 2nd Maccabees, which is, where does the story of the mother and her sons occur? Again, in 2nd Maccabees 6, Eliezer is in Jerusalem, and Antiochus IV is not a character in the story. But when we see in 2nd Maccabees 7 that Antiochus IV is explicitly the villain, right, we are reminded that 2nd Maccabees had told us he'd gone back, that is, Antiochus IV had gone back to Antioch in 168, a full year before the persecution of Judaism in Judea, and he never comes back to Jerusalem. So 4 Maccabees does, in a very subtle way, what 2nd Maccabees did not do, connecting the two stories of Eliezer and the mother and sons in time and place, whereas Eliezer was tortured by Seleukid authorities in Jerusalem, and I think the mother and the 7 sons occurred in Antiochus' court in Antioch. But it doesn't really matter. That's only important for somebody like me. Over the centuries, this story about the mother and sons is no longer tethered to the Antiochian persecution or its time and place, making it universal in its appeal. So these stories become the crown of biblical martyrology, and Kellerman said, the primeval martyr narrative of Judaism and the early church. So this is just to be a quick introduction to Dr. Brodersen's account of a chapter in the transmission of 4 Maccabees. Thank you, Dr. Brodersen.
Thank you. I've unmuted myself. I hope that has worked. And I will try and do what you've done with the presentation. Can you see the presentation?
Ben, first you have to unshare your own presentation.
I thought I did.
I still see yours.
Okay, you're right. You're right.
Okay, now Kai, you can share yours.
I'm doing that, but it seems not to work. Well, as I say, the fireworks.
No, but if that's true, I can put it on for you.
Might be, hang on, might be easier. Yes. Okay. Yeah. If you could do that.
Hold on.
Yeah.
No.
We managed it when we tried half an hour ago. So,
hold on. Okay, we're trying again.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, let's see.
Starts with a topical picture.
I have it. Okay. I'm trying. Oh, there it is.
There it is. And now do the sort of slideshow thing.
So that's from me now.
Okay, so
That's from you.
And I will go to the full screen mode.
Slideshow, top seventh thing on the menu above, where it says slideshow.
Yes, the problem here, the problem is
yeah.
that it's in the double frame. Here.
Yeah, and then from beginning.
And from beginning, got it. Here we go.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. Not everything Altai has said is true, but we'll leave corrections for later. For the moment, my remit is to introduce you to two scenes which are remarkably similar. One is only a couple of hours old, was posted on a website which the president of the US hosts, and as you can see, you have an important figure sitting on the left, and you have 2, 4, 6, 8, 7 plus 1 people sitting opposite him. And if you now go to the next slide, you will see why this image relates to a 16th century one. Here you have King Antiochos IV. In this case, he admits that he is a king, presiding over 7 plus 1 figures. It's the 7 sons and the mother. You see the mother on the right-hand side, in an interrogation, which is the one in Maccabees 7, 2nd Maccabees 7, which is the locus classicus for the story that we'll be looking at today. I won't repeat the content of that interview here, but if you continue to the next one, we can. I will start with this man. Some of you might recognize the face. It's Leon Feuchtwanger, who was a Munich author who published, next slide, in 1932, a book which has the German title Der Jüdische Krieg, the Jewish War, has appeared at the same time in 1932, immediately afterwards in New York, simply as Josephus, and has been in print both in German and in English for the last nearly 100 years. 1932, of course, was a moment in time when it wasn't self-evident that somebody would write on Josephus. And more so, Feuchtwanger created a Jewish author. He himself was a Jew as well, in his own image, or vice versa. So his main protagonist is a man called Josephus, who writes about the Maccabean revolt and finds that he is successful in doing that, but that he is referred to by contemporaries soon as the circumcised Livy, Titus Livius, the beschnittene Livius, in that he is a historian writing about the revolt of the Maccabees against the Seleukids, and at the same time writing from a Jewish perspective. He encounters opposition against his work because, unlike Livy, or unlike Greek and Latin authors who write about the history of their own peoples, and who will not entice revolution by describing events of the 5th century, he is accused of, by simply describing the history of Seleucids and Maccabees, is creating enthusiasm for another revolution, which is very much Feuchtwanger's own life. He emigrated eventually, and he has to realize that writing history can have results which are unintended, but which can be dangerous, and that there could be an influence that might be worth avoiding. He does so eventually by disowning his book on the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, by claiming that this was a work he wrote as a young man and it's not actually by him. So the idea that Feuchtwanger has is that a book that has been known to be by Josephus is eventually disowned by the author himself and becomes something which is a historical thing in itself, irrelevant, historical, nothing to do with the present. Very much the situation he found himself in. We'll come back to Feuchtwanger eventually, but we will have to explore this connection between the story of the Maccabees and the man Josephus slightly further. To do that, we need to realize that the fourth book of Maccabees, which Ben has already introduced us to, is transmitted as part of the Septuagint, as part of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in two of the three main manuscripts. This has consequences. We don't know why that is the case, but the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus both have Maccabees 4 as part of the Bible, of the Greek version of the Old Testament. The Codex Vaticanus does not. One immediate consequence was that the first printed edition of the Septuagint lacks 4 Maccabees, because that was an Aldina published by Aldus Venutius in Venice, Aldus Manutius, who used the Vaticanus as his base and didn't find the Greek text in there, and therefore stopped, didn't include it. How did it, the canonicity of the Maccabean books is contested in any case. We have the first and the second book of the Maccabees, which is in all 3 main manuscripts and in many later manuscripts of the Septuagint, which are part of the Latin Vulgate, of the Vulgata, which are God's word for the Catholics in my country and everywhere in the world, which Martin Luther declared to be of secondary relevance as an apocrypha, but included them in his first full translation of the Bible in 1545. Why did he do that? And there is a preface where he explicitly states why he does this: because he liked the story of the 7 sons and the mother in 2 Maccabees 7, and therefore felt that it's useful to read that. And therefore, even if it's not ipsissima verba Dei, it makes sense to be aware of that story. But the Septuagint editions did not include that, and that is when the text of 4 Maccabees emerges at the early on as a work by Josephus. It's not part of the Septuagint. It's regarded to be a work by Josephus, very much like Feuchtwanger claims for the other books. And it's a book that is first printed as a work of Josephus in Greek in 1526. And if you go to the next slide, is still part of our relevant editions of Josephus. This is Dindorf in the Dido edition. Go to the next one, where it is simply part of Josephus's works. It's not even said to be pseudo-Josephus or anything. It's just Josephus. And the latest Teubner, which admittedly is also 130 years old, next slide, by Samuel Naber. And again, next one has the very same idea. So 4 Maccabees is given the title Peri Autokrateros Logismou and is printed from 1526 till the 19th or early 20th century as part of the works of Josephus, not as part of the Septuagint. It's an interesting story which we can't follow up today to understand why that happened, why the Christian tradition didn't sort of claim the book back to, if you've got 1 and 2 Maccabees, you might as well have 4. But it's complicated by the fact that 3 Maccabees is actually not about the Maccabees, and therefore the Maccabees, books of Maccabees peter out at the end, basically. Anyone who wants to read about 3 Maccabees, Altai's old colleague Stefan Pfeiffer has published the relevant commentary on that. As I say, it's nothing to do with what we're looking at today. So we have a Greek text, which is attributed to Josephus and which is printed in scholarly volumes mainly as Josephus. It also gets into later printed editions of the Septuagint, again usually attributed to Josephus. Next one will show you that there is the obvious question: how did the Middle Ages, who couldn't cope with Greek, react to that? And that is where the story of 4 Maccabees and the Jewish martyrs becomes really interesting. We have about, more than a handful of manuscripts of a Latin paraphrase of 4 Maccabees. It's called Passio Sanctorum Maccabeorum. I try to pronounce Latin with an English voice, so forgive that. So the Passio is circulated in a number of manuscripts. It's probably written about 400 or 450. It's been the first printed edition of this work is in 1938, so not even 100 years ago. The life of this Latin text is entirely in manuscripts, and it was sort of went out of use in the late Middle Ages. The manuscripts stop. There is no printed edition, so reading 4 Maccabees in Latin becomes difficult. Continue. Why did it become difficult? The main the problem has a number of reasons. One very obvious one is that the huge collection of the Acta Sanctorum, with the 19th century collection of the lives of the saints, which goes back to earlier collections, which sorts the saints by date, and knows about the Maccabean martyrs as Christian saints or whatever, to be celebrated on the 1st of August, finds that it is 4 Maccabees, just like Bennett said, is actually just an expansion of 2nd Maccabees 7. Therefore, it's not, as the editor of the Acta Sanctorum so sweetly puts it, it's not Dei ipsius calamo written. It's not written by God's pen, but is written by somebody else. It's also not by Josephus. And we haven't got any decent manuscripts anyway. So the solution that the Bollandists had with the Acta Sanctorum was to not accept that Latin paraphrase, and therefore basically not, refer readers back to the 2nd Maccabees 7, the short story. Ben has shown you that it's a short text that we're sort of referring to there. This is this leads us to the question: what are the main differences? There is the quantity of 4 Maccabees compared to the 1 chapter or the 2 chapters in 2nd Maccabees, and there is added material. Ben has already explained that there are extra biographies, as it were, of the martyrs. And one very obvious extra is that both the mother and the 7 sons get names. They suddenly they acquire names in the fourth Maccabees, which they didn't have beforehand. And one of the points that I'm trying to work out to make today is that we need to find out where these names come from. So, if you continue, we will now come to the main figure that we have. There is another Latin version of Josephus's 4 Maccabees, here in the print owned by the Munich State Library, or Royal Library as it used to be. And you see it's Flavii Josepi viri Judei, peri autocratoros logismu, hoc est de imperatrice ratione, deque incluto septem fratorum Maccabeorum, et ac fortissime orum matris dive Solomone. She now has a name called Solomona. A desiderio Erasmo Rotterdamo diligente recognitus ac emendatus. So, we have a print, the very first Latin print of 4 Maccabees in a publication printed in 1517, 1517, which is attributed to Erasmus of Rotterdam, and which is actually the text that becomes the main translation of 4 Maccabees basically forever. If you remember that we've just looked at Dindorf's bilingual edition of Josephus, he actually simply prints Erasmus with the slight disadvantage that the Greek text and the Latin text differ slightly, for example, by giving names. But basically, if you want the gist of 4 Maccabees, you can use that as well. Why did that happen? Now we need to go to the next slide and look at the man that you can see in his whole golden beauty here. Altai will surely recognize him. This is Reinhard van Dassel, a Cologne archbishop in the 12th century, who is instrumental for making Cologne great again by producing relics of by acquiring relics from Milan of the 3 wise kings. So the drei Könige, the 3 kings, the bones of these 3 kings come to Cologne. Reinhard von Dassel acquires them, brings them there, and is commemorated here on the golden shrine where these relics are housed and are celebrated ever since. He is he works at a time where Cologne, a Roman city, acquires a Christian past, as it were. How Christian the 3 wise men are, of course, is open to the question, but it was relics that were still to be had. And if you continue to the next slide, you will see that they still feature prominently in the Cologne city flag. This is a hotel in Cologne, which I just happened to go past, but you can find that on the web easily. You've got the 3 crowns for the 3 kings, which are defining city saints for Cologne. The other saints on that badge, if you count the flames there, you will count 11, are the 11,000 virgins, probably a misreading of Roman 11, XY, and then M for martyrs, and then virgines, made into 11,000 virgins. The relics of these virgins for Cologne had the big advantage that the martyrdom of St. Ursula, who was the one who came with these virgins, was located near Cologne anyway. So you didn't have to import these, but you had relics of saints which were already there and which you could also venerate. So Cologne in the 12th, 13th century has these double city saints, the 3 kings and the 11,000 virgins, which mark which make this city a very Catholic city. I went there a couple of weeks ago, and I'm a Protestant, so going there is remarkable. Like, you pass a church where basically a poster on one of these foldable stands outside offers you an Ablass if you pray for a little there and things. So it's still a very Catholic city. Go on for a couple of to the next slide, because you have two main groups of saints, the three kings and the 11,000 virgins, but at some stage there were further relics. We can't exactly date them, but we can. It's likely that this is a sort of 14th century development, because that's when the first time a convict, a Benedictine convict for the Maccabean, is attested. There was a church being built for them in a convent, which didn't survive secularization in the early 19th century. All that there is a couple of stones which they found when they built the Hall of Residence for students in Cologne, which you can see here. So they very sweetly put bits of architectural remains of the Maccabean church. If you go to the next one, they also named a street in Cologne Maccabeerstraße, in a rather seedy quarter of north of the station in Cologne. And if you go on, there is that house which replaces the original site of that convent. Next slide will show you the commemorative plate there. So we have an idea where the Benedictine nuns had their convent and where there was a chapel to the Maccabeans. So you have the three kings, you've got the 11,000 virgins, and you have a vague idea of the Maccabeans. Let's go to the turn of the century from so just after 1500, and that's then when that's a time which in the turn, early modern age, sort of turn from Middle Ages to modern age, where relics become suddenly even more relevant, where they are extremely exciting. The most celebrated case is Wittenberg, just north of where I live. Wittenberg has an elector, a Kurfürst, who builds a university in 1502, very much to the detriment of Erfurt, which is where I am, and which was already more than 100 years old, but never mind. Friedrich der Weise, Frederick the Wise, builds that university. He's a Catholic and starts collecting relics. And he starts collecting relics very, very intensively. A couple of hundred of them arrive at Wittenberg. Lucas Cranach the Elder makes images of them, and the idea is to establish Wittenberg, which was, well, like Rome, a city made of mud brick, into a sizable, big university city and electoral city. Trouble is that Wittenberg, as you know, becomes the home of the Reformation. And among the many ideas that the Lutheran tradition has is getting rid of indulgences. So you can't get, well, you still can get them in Cologne, you can't get them in Wittenberg. And also getting rid of relics. You don't need them anymore. So Frederick the Wise basically sells them. He sells them to everywhere. The altar of the 1,000 martyrs is now in Vienna as a work of art, and all the rest is basically gone because you don't need these physical reminders of saints. Very different in Cologne. if you go to the next slide, we'll meet somebody who exactly at the same time, also in 1502, discovers that Cologne can actually do with more than just the 3 kings and the 11,000 martyrs. It's a man called Elias Merz. He comes from Merz. Here is an aerial view of Merz, which is now an open cast mine, and the village has been destroyed and lost. It's near Jülich, so Altai's old home isn't very far away from it. But he takes his real name was Schmidt, which, like my doctor father, he takes his name from where he came from. If you continue, I can't show you how he looked, sort of a portrait, but in the manuscript that we've already seen an image of, you have HM for Elias Merz, Elijah Merz. And his Latinized humanist name was Elias de Luna, of the moon, which is why his other badge is the man in the moon. Elias Merz had studied in Cologne, was an active person, probably rich or very good in acquiring extra funds, and has this mission to create further saints for Cologne. The 3 kings and the 11,000 virgins were already established. In fact, St. Ursula and the 11,000 virgins had 2 churches, so he very cleverly uses one of them, which was somehow not very central, to provide him with some medieval works of art. And he uses the fact that the earlier Church of the Maccabees, which had burnt down because the brewery of the convent had burnt down and had taken most of the other buildings with it, to rebuild that church. So in just 3 years, between 1502 and 1505, he builds a new church and a new convent to honor the 7 Maccabean brothers and the mother as Christian saints. It's now quite clear that he regards these as like the 3 wise men, which was very handy, as Christian enough to be people to emulate. And if you continue, we can see what the problem is, and you will already have guessed this. The problem is that there is no available Latin, i.e. readable text of the legend. It's not part of the Vulgate Bible. Apart from Maccabees 2:7, the long version isn't there. And he needs a Latin text. He wants to print a Latin text. He starts by printing a vernacular German book, which is illustrated in 1507. He reprints it in 1517, 10 years later, again as a vernacular book. And to make the legend more approachable, as it were, he finds names for the 7 brothers and the mother, which we had, which are not in the versions that were attributed to Josephus and not in the version of the Passio. They're called Maccabeus, interesting, Aber, Machir, Judas, Akas, Areth, Jacob, and the mother is called Salomona. So they are names that contemporaries in the early 16th century will have associated with Jewish names. Calling the eldest brother Maccabeus isn't terribly inventive, but it makes sense. And using Salomon to name the mother also was meant to ring a bell, and calling one of the brothers Judas also made sense. So he produces or enhances a local legend about these Maccabees by giving extra material to the legend. He's not concerned with the Passio and not with Josephus, but he's producing two books in the vernacular to make people aware of these martyrs, which are now celebrated in the rebuilt Church of the Maccabees in the Maccabeerstraße. His books are difficult to find. There are very few copies nowadays, which is very typical for vernacular books which were meant to be read and distributed and then didn't end up in scholarly libraries. There's one at Krakow, which is why we know what it is, and one has been reprinted in a collection of early German verse, where the editor calls it slaughterhouse poetry, because Schlachthauspoesie is the German for it, because they reproduce the rather cruel descriptions of torture that we find in 4 Maccabees and indeed in the Passio. Still no Latin. Now, if you live in Cologne, you need somebody who knows Latin, and you need to find out somebody who gives credibility, street cred to this idea that they are important martyrs. A name that comes up in the early 16th century is Erasmus of Rotterdam. He didn't know him immediately, but it so happens that we know that Erasmus had friendly relations to the nuns at the Benedictine convent in the Maccabeerstraße. That's where the Swedes in my title sort of come from. He is in a different work, he writes to the nuns there, semel atque iterum, tragematis ac dulciaris, quibustam provocat me vestra pietas virgines optime. Again and again, the sweets and confectionery that you give me provoke, your piety provokes me to do something for you. So there was, Erasmus had friends in Cologne who basically did what we call the praline diplomacy. So whenever he came between Leuven, where he stayed, and Basel, where he went, he could rely on sweets from them, and they sent him these things for the new year. So Elias Merz knew that there was a connection to Mr. Erasmus, and he used it. If you continue, we can see what happened. He kidnaps or entices Erasmus on one of the journeys between Leuven and Basel to stop over in Cologne to produce a Latin version of the 4 Maccabees, of the reason why the Maccabean martyrs, the 7 brothers and the mother, are valuable Christian saints. This becomes the book that we've seen the title of already. In the dedication of that book, Erasmus is very open about what he did. It was unius dieculae appella. It was the little work of one day, which he gave to Elias, and what he did was to recognito et quod liquid emendato Josephi libello de septem fratrum. So he edited, and as far as it was allowed, emendated the little book by Josephus, which in fact is probably the Passio. But he had one problem. He knew that Josephus wrote in Greek. Elias didn't provide him with the Greek text, so what he did, third paragraph, is Quoniam Graecus codex ad manum non erat, because I, Erasmus, didn't have a Greek manuscript at hand. E Latinis Graeca conjectans mutavi non nulla. I guessed, I conjectured from the Latin that I had in front of me, the original Greek, and changed the text accordingly, non ad modum multa, but not very much. So Josephus's Latin version of the Greek for Maccabees is actually based on Latin translations, which he used to divine what the Greek might have been, and then change the Latin accordingly. It's that sort of multifaceted or there are many breaks in that tradition, which make it so remarkable that this is now actually the Latin text that will survive in the for the future and will be the one Latin book that surpasses everything. The Passio is never printed until 1938. Erasmus's Latin version of what is considered to be Josephus's Greek for Maccabees is printed and reprinted and reprinted. Erasmus becomes very famous, as indeed does Josephus, both, and it's always this Latin version of 1517, which is used even to the point that the names that Elias Merz had created or taken over from a local tradition, we don't know, calling the first brother Maccabeus and the mum Solomona, becomes part of the Erasmus tradition with no evidence in the Greek text. Basically, he knows who pays him, or if he is indebted to the nuns for the sweets he's been given. So we get the message that the saints, even though they are Jewish, and Erasmus is very fair in producing a text which claims, which always emphasizes that they are law-abiding Jews, that they abide by God's law. And it's easy for him then to say, so should we, without this debating further if there are differences between the Jewish and the Christian version of how to deal with the laws that the Maccabeans adhered to. So we have Erasmus producing what within a day, based on some odd Latin versions and his knowledge of Greek, a retranslation of imagined Greek into Latin, producing what becomes the final version of that. But if you go to the next slide, we can understand even better why this version became so important. It was published, you've seen the title page, in Latin, therefore became readable outside Cologne, not in the Cologne vernacular, but sort of widely read. And it was illustrated with an imagery which associated the seven brothers and the mother with images that worked in the Christian tradition as well. The version from the Erasmus book of 1517, actually taken from the vernacular books already, is, as you can see, in a tradition which presents the Virgin Mary with a pallium, which she sort of wraps around the believers. In this case, the figure depicted is Salomona, the Jewish mother, and her seven sons, which she looks after. The viewer of the image will immediately understand that this is that the Maccabean mum is a prefiguration of the Virgin Mary, and therefore one image tells two stories. If you continue, you will see the same idea in an elaborate version in the Codex. That is a little aside, but it's something which I found personally very fascinating. I've told you that one of the problems was that there was no printed version of the Latin Passio. So there was no way of distributing the text why the Maccabean brothers mattered. Merz produced with Erasmus the Latin version. And at the same time, Elias Merz had a codex produced, which survives in the Cologne Erzbischöfliche Bibliothek, the Archbishop's Library, 236 huge parchment pages, beautifully written, beautifully illustrated, which happens at a time when the printing press was not only invented, but was the means of transporting ideas. He still invested in a codex. We actually know the Sitz im Leben, the setting for this codex. It was to be shown on August the 1st, the day of the Maccabees, to the public as well, a sort of relic, as a sort of evidence that this is a valuable, important story, which you can see in that beautiful codex. It's not just any old print that a Cologne printer put out, but it has the aura of a medieval codex. The codex is, as you can see here, written in 1525. It's an interesting idea that that at the time when we usually imagine manuscripts are gone, they produce that. It's actually copied, and we can see that from errors in the printed version, copied straight from the printed version into that manuscript. So it's quite clear, because the printed version is 8 years older, that this is it's a showpiece, but it's an interesting showpiece in that it also produces these images, which then become formative. Next slide. In the presentation of the relics, the last thing, or another thing that Elias Merz produced was the Maccabean shrine, the shrine of the Maccabees, containing these relics. You see Maccabeorum corpora written at the bottom line here, and if you sort of squint your eyes, you will recognize this idea of the Schutzmantel Madonna, of the Virgin sort of surrounding the seven with her pallium, very much in the style that we have seen in the Codex. It's actually quite clear that the shrine is slightly later, that the artists who produced the shrine for Elias Merz had access to the Codex, or whatever was the origin of the Codex, the drawings for the Codex, and produced them there. The shrine is still visible in Cologne. It's now in St. Andrew's Church, St. Andreaskirche, because the Maccabean Kirche isn't there anymore, but that has been transferred to another church where it's still very much on display. So, if we come to the final two slides, if we I'll show you another one from the Codex, which shows you in a sort of nutshell what we have seen today already. You have the mother, the seven sons in a cauldron. One of the martyrdoms is that they are cooked, boiled, or indeed cooked. In that slaughterhouse poetry, that's one of the scenes that probably was appealing to the gore of the readership. You've got Elias Merz, HM, and the Man in the Moon here at the end of the Latin version, Flavius Josephus, per autocratus logismu, it est de imperatrice ratione libelli finis. Manuscript copy of the printed version of Erasmus's version of the 4 Maccabees. The final slide will show you the version that is in the printed version of that very same story. Again, you've got the cooking, the boiling of the martyrs and their mother. But here, in the printed version, without the setting in the church, without that Sitz im Leben that we have for the Codex, the connection between the Jewish legend and the Christian ideas, using the Jewish legend as a prefiguration of Christian tradition, becomes sort of as visible as it gets. You've got a clear view of the crucifixion as a sort of in the background of the martyrdom here. And in case you don't get it, there is that blurb, as it were, in the sky, which shows the actual crucifixion scene. The other one is the flagellation, to allow you to understand that there is an immediate connection between what happens in the story that you've just read in Erasmus Latin and your own tenets of your religion, of your belief. So you have that thing. There are indeed 15 of these woodcuts. They are all have the same motive. You always have one of the martyrdoms and then one of the scenes of the Passion, which allow you to sort of, understand immediately, especially if you can't read, where the connection between these two stories is to be seen. So what I've been trying to show you tonight is, or this morning, if for those of you on the other side of the pond, is that we have a legend which is clearly set in the wars between the Seleucids, Antiochos IV, and the Maccabeans, which is expanded already at some stage. Ben has said, one usually thinks of Antioch in the 1st century AD, CE. The reason for that is that there are some traditions that claim that some of the relics were in Antioch at the time, and therefore it makes sense to assume that it was there, which is then transferred both physically by transporting bones and mentally by transporting the text into the West, in that case to Cologne. Cologne needed extra saints, had a small tradition of Maccabeans there already, and at the time, which is theologically one of the most exciting times in our history, in that the debate is on whether we actually believe in that kind of tradition or whether the Wittenberg Reformation is a better way to salvation, where the Cologne idea is, no, we've got extra saints, we invest a lot of material there, and the fact that we, even to the latest Teubner of Josephus, use a text that has this sort of rather weird history is something I found interesting. I hope you did as well. Thank you. In case you want to send hate mail to me, there you are.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so what I want to do, first of all, thank you. I mean, that was a wonderful and clear presentation. And so I want to start with the word Maccabee and Maccabeus, because the presentation you just made is, to me, not only interesting but sort of astonishing from a certain point of view. Over and over, we're talking about the Maccabees. And as you said, and this part I did not know, that one of the sons is even called Maccabeus. So let's go back a couple of steps. The singular word Maccabeus is the epithet for Judah the Maccabee, and seems to be a heroic name for a warrior who was famous even before the revolt. In 1st and 2nd Maccabees, we never see the plural Maccabees for the rebel force. That's an interesting fact that I don't think I actually knew. Mattathias, that is the father of the 5 brothers, is called the Hasmonean, and the dynasty will be the Hasmonean dynasty, not the Maccabean dynasty. So the 5 brothers, who I want to say again, are never called the Maccabees in these books, are the sons of Mattathias. And how did Mattathias rise to to fame and to power. He rose to renown in opposition to martyrdom when he declared that the Jews could defend themselves even on the Sabbath rather than be martyred, as some had been by the Seleukid persecutors. And I want to read you. At that time also, this is at the beginning of the persecution, many of the Israelites who were seeking to be right with God through obedience to the law went out to live in the wilderness, taking their children, their wives, and their livestock with them because of the terrible oppression they were suffering. The report soon reached the king's officials and the soldiers in the fort at Jerusalem that some men who had defied the king's command had gone into hiding in the wilderness. A large force of soldiers pursued them, caught up with them, set up camp opposite them, and prepared to attack them on the Sabbath. There's still time, they shouted out to the Jews. Come out and obey the king's command, and we will spare your lives. We will not come out, they answered. We will not obey the king's command, and we will not profane the Sabbath. So the soldiers attacked them immediately, but the Jews did nothing to resist. They did not even throw stones or block the entrances to the caves where they were hiding. They said, we will all die with a clear conscience. Let heaven and earth bear witness that you are slaughtering us unjustly. So the enemy attacked them on the Sabbath and killed the men, their wives, their children, their livestock. 1,000 people died. Now, what happens is Mattathias, who was an obscure priest in the little town of Modi'in, rises to power because he says, we're not going to let that happen. Now, remember that the Jews at this point have centuries of loyalty to one foreign power after another. They never rebelled. And so what he's going to do is breathtaking. And he's going to say, okay, we were going to fight. And that's what begins the revolution. So my point is that Mattathias becomes in opposition to martyrdom. In opposition to martyrdom. So we can distinguish between those who are nonviolent resistors willing to be martyred and Mattathias and Judas Maccabeus, who broke hundreds of years of passive loyalty to their foreign rulers to rebel in armed resistance. It is so ironic that the martyrs that Kai's been talking about become known as the Maccabees. By the way, a little charming irony for me is that Christianity should celebrate their heroism for being willing to die rather than eat pork, but I won't get into that. While I think this story occurs in Antioch, to which Antiochus had returned, those who see the tale as outside of time and place really win the argument, as through the centuries the sons become the quintessential martyrs. So in First Maccabees, why do the Jews win? Because Mattathias and Judas Maccabeus win. But in Second and Fourth Maccabees, it's all because of the sacrifices of the martyrs that Judas wins. Second Maccabees 6 through 7 are the center of the book. Before them, there's terror, and after their martyrdom, there's victory. So Second Maccabees changed. Why did the Jews win? Not because of Judas Maccabees, but because God saw the martyrdom of Eliezer and the mother and the 7 sons. And here's what they say in this sort of linchpin of Second Maccabees. These then who have been consecrated for the sake of God are honored not only with this honor, but also by the fact that because of them, our enemies did not rule over our nation, the tyrant was punished, and the homeland purified. They having become, as it were, a ransom for the sin of our nation. And through the blood of those pious ones and their deaths as an atoning sacrifice, divine providence preserved Israel, who previously had been mistreated. So again, First Maccabees said the Jews won because of victories, because of guerrilla warfare and all of these things. And here it's because of the martyrs that they were able to win. So it's an interesting irony that the martyrs become known as the Maccabees, and that the books on these events were later called the books of the Maccabees. The phrase, the second Maccabees and their mother, is incredibly ironic. Now the 7 martyrs who would have been criticized by Judas Maccabeus and his father become the Maccabees. Now, I'm not going to tell you what Judas Maccabeus would have said about a church dedicated to the martyrs or any other human being, or any other human beings for that matter, or about the icons in that church, or about any church. I'm not going to say anything about that. But I want to point out that Mattathias, again, is called the Hasmonean, and the dynasty will be the Hasmonean dynasty, not the Maccabean dynasty. And in Jewish tradition, Kai was talking about the names, and that's a very important point. But the mother, in Jewish tradition, acquires different names at different points. At one point, she's Hannah, like Hannah in the Bible, right, who is this mother who had been infertile and sort of becomes a quintessential Jewish mother, along with Rachel, a famous name for mothers. But in one tradition, she's called Hashmonit, which is the female Hasmonean. That mother becomes the Hasmonean. So there are two viewpoints, and I'm going to get to an audacious claim in 1 minute. So you have one stream of tradition, which is violent resistors, the real Maccabees, that is Judas Maccabeus. That goes to the first Maccabees, and then the tradition comes down to the Zealots and Bar Kokhba. But the other tradition is nonviolent resistors, Mother and Sons, the Book of Daniel, Second Maccabees, and Christianity. And so that's why, all the Maccabee books are not in the Jewish canon, because this is not that important. It's post-biblical and when things were canonized in. But Second Maccabees is in the canon for Catholics. So here's my audacious claim. We've been talking in our field about the legacy of the Seleucids and what the Seleucids left behind. I want to claim that this story that Kai's been telling us is the most famous aspect of legacy of the Seleucids in a very ironic way. It's because of the Seleukid persecution of the Jews under Antiochos IV Epiphanes that two distinct and oppositional themes arose. Again, nonviolent resistance to tyranny, which will be important in Judaism, but foundational to Christianity, and violent armed resistance to tyranny, de-emphasized in Christianity and in Jewish tradition, especially in rabbinic lore, after the Second Great Revolt in the 130 CE, which was so disastrous for the Jews. So my claim is that the legacy of the Seleukid era, more perhaps than anything else that's come down to us from the Seleucids, is that it produces two streams about resistance to power that are of major import for Judaism and Christianity. So that's what I wanted to say. I want to thank Kai again for that wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you to both of you. That was fantastic. It's so fascinating to see how traditions actually come into being and how far away they may be from the events themselves, from the intentions themselves. So that was a wonderful cooperation between Kai and Ben. I have a couple of questions, and I will stop immediately when someone from the audience comes first. But I think we should first give Kai the opportunity to respond to Ben's ideas.
Should work now. Yeah, thank you. That is sort of I hadn't worked it out as clearly as you have with these two, as it were, opposing traditions. When I did Old Testament studies, we learned that it's convention to call them Maccabees, and then when they become rulers, we call them Hasmoneans, because that is basically a way of organizing scholarship rather than anything to do with it. But your point is absolutely relevant to say, no, it's more than that. It's not just Beloch or whoever sort of trying to find suitable chapter headings, so from that point of view, it's interesting. I also found it very sort of valuable to look at the tradition that we have, which separates the versions from each other. You've only alluded to this idea that the Josephus Erasmus text actually makes everything about eating pork. Because, well, I mean, I imagine that this is, again, the contemporary audience, which, like the cauldron, this is where you boil your sausages, and that is something you can imagine. And it's also something that contemporary people in Cologne would have been aware of as one of the visible differences. Of course, all the sort of wider issues aren't there. I would like to expand that, not tonight, but at some stage, going back to Feuchtanger, whom I started with, because he has this idea that First and Second Maccabees, and in that case, both of them, are a call to arms, that they are there to allow you to do, or can be read as enticing violence against the oppressor. He's deliberately vague about which parts of the books of Maccabees he's referring to, but it'll be worth to reread him, and I've fortunately got him here on my desk, to find out whether he's actually cleverer than I have given him credit for in that case. So thank you, that was good.
Well, thank you again. I have a first question to you, Kai, trying to bring all the pieces a little bit more closely together. I think what you have presented was good background on the ancient sources, and then a very clear focus on what Helias Merz and Erasmus contributed to the discussion. And you gave us many clues as to what came before and what would follow next. But if you can perhaps elucidate a little bit more the time between Reinhard von Dassel, who I think most in the audience will be more familiar with the name Frederick Barbarossa, who of course conquered Milan and then made it possible for Reinhard to get these relics of the three kings from Milan. And so in the medieval evidence for the 12th century, there is no hint of the Maccabees yet. And then we have that monastery, that Benedictine monastery dedicated to the Maccabees. And I don't know how far could you trace back the origin either of the monastery or of the Patrocinium. And also, how far could you trace back the 1st of August as the day on which the martyrs, the Maccabees, were celebrated? And I'm asking that question because in the text you've quoted from Erasmus, we learn that he had various Latin texts available. So that I conclude that Helias Merz already drew on a literary tradition, and you were quite cautious to say you're not sure whether he invented the names or he might have found them in the sources. But can we narrow down the time when actually the legend arrived in Cologne, and perhaps think of a reason, a motivation, a purpose for being invented in Rome, or Cologne. I meant Cologne, of course. Invented in Cologne, introduced to Cologne, and then shaped after the model from the 12th century, from Barbarossa and Reinhold. Have you got some ideas to specify? I saw you were very cautious. You tried not to speculate too much and to tread on very safe ground, which you did. But do you have some bits and pieces for us to fill this gap?
Quick answer, no. What we have is the manuscripts of the Passio, which is whenever it happens, the date that Dury suggests 400, and the Italian colleagues whose cover I've shown you is 50 years later, is of course not clear, because that it is based on language or style, as you do with these things. There is no firm date in the text itself. I've tried rather a lot to find out about these names. It was interesting that Ben remarked that there are Jewish traditions that have yet other names there. What I could see is that the Helias Merz names make their way one-to-one into Erasmus, which isn't surprising, because after all, he got the sweets. He got whatever he was given for this work of a day, which delayed his arrival at Basel. With the earlier evidence for the Church of the Maccabeans in Cologne is actually very slight. It's archival sources, which I haven't seen at first sort of at first sight, but quote from the Denkmalliste, from the description of the lost churches in Cologne, which the building historians have produced. But it's something that might be actually worth following up. There is no evidence I'm aware of that Erasmus had anything but the Passio, because you can explain the differences between Dury's edition of the Passio. Dury, of course, had access to Erasmus because that was printed in 1517, and the Erasmus version. So I haven't seen anyone suggesting that there were rival manuscripts with the Passio. The idea of Dury's work in 1938 was to look at the manuscripts that he was aware of, and there are about 36 of them, to make, as one does as a philologist, an archetype, an original text, and then use the manuscript to show where they differ from that, which is, given that this is a semi-Seleukid text, is not very much. So this is very stable. But what you say would suggest that it's worth, which is now easier than it was in 1938, checking for snippets of texts, so from Erasmus, whether they actually come from a different tradition, which is not called Passio Septem Maccabeorum, but might be something completely different. We can't use the names because in that alternative tradition there might be something else in there. And given the state of scholarship on the lives of the saints from 5th century to the 15th, there is a lot of work to be done. We still rely on the Acta Sanctorum for most of them, and in that case they excluded them, so they didn't bother to do that work. So that might be worth looking at. I'm sure I'm not the right person to do that because I'm not a medieval historian, but it's worth a thought. Where the only caveat I would have is that we have to rely on Erasmus's kind words to his master, to Elias Merz, that he had plural manuscripts, which means at least two. Whether that is true, of course, we have no way of knowing. None of the manuscripts that Dury in 1938 looked at, and the Italian edition is not a critical one, it basically reproduces Dury's text, but comments on it. None of the ones that he has studied is sort of immediately clearly the copy that Erasmus had in front of him, which is, for Dury and others, the slight worry that there might be more around, might be lost, might be filed under a different title, might be whatever. Because, of course, to understand how Erasmus works, it would be really nice to know the pages that Elias Merz gave him to say, make something decent of it, and try to recreate the Greek and then retranslate the imagined Greek back into Latin so that it looks more plausible than this medieval stuff that I've given you, because that is what happens there. But it's a good idea. I will try and find someone willing to look at that. So.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Susan, please.
Fabulous presentations. Really, really interesting. I don't believe Josephus to be the most reliable of historians, but I do see he is very pro-Judaism in a way that he gives the names to the individuals that didn't have names. And I was wondering if we would consider 4 Maccabees to be more a fictional piece of Josephus trying to make history believable or relatable to to later generations, because I just don't see him as being, given that people would change his work and add to it, and he never went, no, this is history, we can't change it.
Yeah.
Would you consider that?
Kai, you're still on mute.
Kai, you have to unmute.
There we are. Okay. Thank you. That's very good. That's why I like this Feuchtwanger's idea of the circumcised Livy there, because with Livy we have that he gives names to early Roman history in a way that that we can't control anyway. So that's a good point. Now, my idea was more something that perhaps Ben can illuminate on. It's 4 Maccabees is, as it were, an expansion, diegesis, whatever, on these 2 chapters in 2nd Maccabees. And what I would dearly like to understand more of is whether that kind of expanding on a text which creates more information without contradicting the basis, i.e., what our friends in the Acta Sanctorum call the Calamus Dei, because God wrote 2nd Maccabees, whereas 4th Maccabees is only Josephus. Whether there is a tradition in which 4 Maccabees, whether it's written by Josephus or somebody else, doesn't matter, can be placed. I'm not educated enough to know whether similar things happen elsewhere. In Old Testament studies, you learn that you look at the Judges and Chronicles to see sort of the 2 versions, but they are closer than what we see here. Is there anything that you've been aware of, or a similar kind of expansion of more canonized texts?
If you're asking me, yes. And I mean, this is unusual in terms of how much it's expanded, but there's a whole, Eric Gruen has done a lot of work in this area of looking at Greek Jewish things. And the point I was trying to make before about harmonizing Platonic and Stoic philosophy with Judaism, which is something, that Judaism has always done. In other words, Maimonides will take Aristotle and the Bible, and so one of the reasons that Judaism's always survived is harmonizing with the best from the outside. So here, I think it's an attempt to do that, and it's also about like the sovereignty of reason, that since I'm going to be resurrected, since I'm going to live, immortal, it just stands to reason that I should allow myself to be slaughtered. So this kind of logic. But that's what it's saying there. But it's also, like Josephus and like what Susan was saying about putting the Judaism's best foot forward, and often to a non-Jewish audience, right? To say, yes, we've got all your stuff plus our stuff, and it all works, and we're not contradicting you. And so yes, there's short takes. This is almost like a philosophical midrash on those 2 chapters in 2nd Maccabees.
Thank you. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I would, unless anyone else would like to go forward, I have one further question, which I was thinking about even before coming into this lecture after reading a former draft of yours, Kai, namely the conflict between a very legendary, exaggerated story that requires a lot of faith on the one hand, and then the title, The Sovereignty of Reason, and the introduction of philosophy and so on. And then this thought has been reframed in very interesting ways when you put it into the context of the alternative pathways between Catholicism and the Reformation. Though, is there any possible way that there is an influence of by what Luther did in Halle in the same year in 1517 and the translation. So I'm not aware of the fine chronology of 1517 or whether something was in the air that was so the synchrony is certainly amazing, and you expressed also the implication of how such a text may have been perceived and interpreted in a larger context, and then something an additional frame Ben added with the Maccabean alternative in 1 and 2 Maccabees. So it's quite interesting when we think about how the authors thought about the effect of the text and how possible recipients or readers thought about this. And I wonder not so much about the common people, common folks who were much more faithful or were not really accustomed at expressing or articulating doubts and concerns, but whether there is any further reflection of, well, the very rational emphasis of this text on the one hand and the very obvious legendary nature. So that has been stimulating my thought. Have you got a comment on this?
Yeah, thank you. There's an echo. It doesn't matter. It's. I think I would start by looking at Luther's preface to Second Maccabees, where he explains why he thinks it's valuable to read that. Now, of course, what Ben has sort of worked out, this idea of, I can't contribute to my salvation because it's God's thing to eventually help me, is very much the Protestant idea. Original sin is something you can't get rid of. Baptism doesn't help you. Nothing helps you. It's solus Deus who can help you. It's his own. You can be, if you're faithful and things. It's gratia Deo which will help you, and that is why in this preface he very beautifully says that he knows this is not part of the canon, but the story in 2 Maccabees 6 and 7 is so beautiful that I will actually translate it in even the first version of Luther before he produces the other Apocrypha includes Maccabees 1 and 2 and then while at the same time explaining that they shouldn't be there, but that appeals to him. It's worth exploring that, which goes well beyond what we can do today. But any further, I currently have done more work on that sort of time around that, especially in Wittenberg. And as you say, these are ideas that we needn't fix on a specific date. This is very much the sort of stuff they discuss. I have a beautiful sort of collective biography of people in the first decade of the 16th century at Wittenberg, where they're all Catholic, and then 10 years later, one is so Catholic that he emigrates to Austria. One goes to Rostock because he feels, everything happens later in the northeast of Germany, so, I can sit it out there. Two become really fervent reformators, and the sisters of all these then also intermarry. So I imagine that this is very much something debated in the almshouse in the pubs in Wittenberg at the time, and which is why Cologne is such a clear contrast, because they start at the beginning of the century from the same premise: we need relics. We need anything that we can get hold of. There's the blood author. This is a stone which was later used as a font, which was said to be the stone where the blood of the 11,000 virgins was sort of collected. Fair enough. And you can still see it. It's also in St. Andrew's Church. What the original thing of that is, nobody knows. But so you use local material that you have, and you use other material that you can get hold of. And then Reformation basically means that this is nothing. Yeah, this is not. We don't need that. Why would we need sort of physical evidence of martyrdom? Because things happen in the head, and we needn't be martyred to get God's grace. We need to do other things. And so Wittenberg makes this huge step of abandoning nearly 1,000 relics, getting rid of all the artwork that came with it, and distributes them to whoever cares, Vienna, Nuremberg, whoever sort of picked the stuff up. Cologne invests in these magnificent, shrine in that Codex of 1525, and in another legend of the Maccabees, which Sincinius, you've mentioned him earlier, has written just for the Codex, because he felt that we need another version of the legend, which is more to a contemporary taste. He was a scholar, a humanist scholar, in the Erasmian tradition in Werden in Essen nowadays, and happened to flee to Cologne when the pestilence hit Essen. So he left his convent, male Benedictine convent, and found refuge with the female Benedictines in Cologne for some time, which was also quite interesting. But that's well beyond the point. But thank you for alerting me to that.
Well, then our time is up. Let me thank you very dearly again, Kai, for this wonderful presentation, and also Ben, who had to leave, I think, to his class. So had Susan, and let me also end by announcing our next lecture, which will be given by Dr. Aaron Almagor on the 10th of February. So this time not the 3rd, but the 2nd Wednesday in a month. The title is not yet set, but the topic will be on elephants, which is in fact a neat connection because the Seleukid elephants play an important role in the Maccabean tradition as well. But I do think that the focus will be on the Battle of Ipsos, and more details will soon be released on our website. So a lot's going on in the field of Seleukid studies in all its ramifications. Thank you, Kai, once again, and may you all stay tuned and healthy through the winter.